This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. That's Jeremiah 1:5. Guys, thanks so much for listening to the podcast today. Before we get in, I just wanted to thank all the guys that have currently hopped on to donate to what we're doing with our ministry. As I've told you before, we've given away hundreds of hours worth of content with the podcast, with the devotionals. And the only way we're able to do that is because of guys like you, generous guys like you, that are getting together to donate, whether that's on a monthly basis or a one-time basis. And I know end of year giving is coming up for a lot of you guys. So I would just like to go straight out and be the living commercial for you that we would love for you to consider giving to what we're doing with our ministry so we can continue to equip men around the globe to push back darkness. But today, guys, we're going to be getting into a very sensitive subject for a lot of guys, but it's something that I talk about here on the podcast almost monthly. Something comes up in the area of abortion, but this one's going to be different. So we're not going to really be going over a lot of news. This one is going to be tangible. I want you guys to start becoming more and more comfortable with engaging pro-abortion arguments. And that's what they are. They're not pro-choice arguments. They're pro-abortion arguments, right? And we've done some things like this in the past where we've taught you how to, kind of argue in different things, and informing you and keeping you up to date on the news is one of the ways that we continue to do that as well. But we want to get really, really practical. But before we really get into what we're going to be talking about today, I know that this subject might be upsetting for some people. Okay. The point is not to upset you, because I know our audience is mainly male, but we do have some women here. The point is not to upset you. The point is to equip you, because for the most part, the church has done a terrible job of doing that. Right. And so that's kind of the second reason why I'm talking about this, is because pastors won't talk about abortion in detail. I mean, the church that I go to in the last, 3-4 years that I've been there, I think the pastor has talked about this subject for, 5 or 6 minutes. The church I was at before then, for over a decade, the pastor spent 0 minutes talking about this subject. And so what happens is a lot of people that are in the churches, they get, spun up by these pro-choice arguments, and they're like, well, that sounds plausible. But it's not plausible. It's deadly. And so that's one of the reasons we're talking about this as well. But also I want to be cognizant of this as well, because this has come up in the past. I know the statistics around abortion. And so it is very highly likely that some of the women that are listening to this right now have had an abortion. And that, some or a lot of the men that are listening to this have stood by and allowed an abortion to happen. Or paid for one, or drove someone to get an abortion, dropped them off and picked them up, kind of a situation. And the thing is again, today is not about making anybody, feel upset, but it's not about anyone feeling condemned either, right? The idea is that Jesus died for those sins as well. And it's not really the idea, it's the reality, right? So if you had an abortion, or you've sat by and you let an abortion happen, let someone kill your baby, Jesus died for that as well. You do need to repent of that sin. You need to ask for forgiveness for that sin. But again, that's not the point of the podcast for today. Now, I also want to tell you that we're not going to be able to spend a lot of time on certain subjects. We're not going to be able to get into, the jurisprudence around the Roe v. Wade decision, right? We don't really have time to get into that. Also, we're not going to really be talking about, the history of pro-life or pro-abortion movements in the United States. Some of that might get weaved into the content here. We're not going to be able to get into the current Texas and Mississippi abortion laws that are all the way up to the Supreme Court. Those decisions aren't really going to come down for quite some time if there's any indication coming from what's gone on with SCOTUS previously. So we've got a lot of time to think through that. We're not going to be able to talk about in vitro fertilization. I know that that's a lot, you might think that's not really, related to the abortion discussion, even though it kind of is. We don't really have time to get into that. This is what we're going to be discussing today on this. This is how we're going to equip you in this subject matter. The first thing is we're going to go over abortion by the numbers. Okay. Because I think a lot of guys, a lot of people in general have no idea what the numbers are when it comes to abortion. Then we're also going to get into detail into very popular abortion procedures, because again, I think most people don't have any idea what actually happens in an abortion. And then the meat of our time today is going to be spent talking to you about how you can engage pro-abortion arguments, because we have to go on the offensive with a lot of these things. So abortion by the numbers, abortion procedures, and then engaging pro-abortion arguments. So let's get into the very first thing, abortion by the numbers. So we're going to go off, 2020 for some of these statistics, but let's start for the world. In 2020, around 73 million babies were killed worldwide via abortion. 73 million. That's according to the Guttmacher Institute. And just as an aside here, I'm going to try to get all of these different things I'm referring to, all the different numbers into the show notes. Even if I don't refer to them at the end, I want to kind of like show my work on all these things. But even if I don't say, hey, this is where that stat came from, know that it came from a reputable place. I'll try to make sure that's all in there so it's nice and professional and buttoned up for you. But 73 million babies were killed worldwide in 2020 using abortion. But as a point of comparison, heart disease killed about 19 million people. That's according to the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Cancer killed around 10 million people worldwide. That's according to the World Health Organization. And then people that died with COVID, right? Because a lot of these people didn't die specifically from COVID because they had so many other comorbidities. That was around 3 million people in 2020 died. That's according to the World Health Organization. So 73 million abortion, 19 million heart disease, 10 million cancer, 3 million with COVID, right? So that's about 200,000 babies a day were slaughtered in the womb. And worldwide, about 1/4 of all pregnancies ended in abortion. And that doesn't include, people that miscarried. So that's not included there. These are people that were going to do something with that child, either allow it to be born or kill it. 1/4 of all pregnancies worldwide ended in abortion. But now let's go to America, right? The country where I reside. In 2020, around 850,000 babies were aborted. And as a little quick aside here, I'm not being super specific on these numbers, like to the exact number. And I don't do that by any means to diminish the importance of any of those individual lives, obviously. But a lot of these numbers are hard to get perfectly exact. They change by the day, if you're doing up-to-date stats or something like that. So I'm doing, I'm just kind of trying to stay in the pocket there a little bit. So in America, 850,000 abortions in 2020. That's about 2,600 per day. And since Roe v. Wade in 1973, over 60 million babies have been murdered just in the United States. Okay. And then Planned Parenthood, which we'll get a lot more into here in a little bit, they killed around 320,000 of that 850,000 babies last year in 2020. That's essentially one child every 97 seconds was killed by Planned Parenthood. One child every 97 seconds. So that's abortion by the numbers. But now let's go ahead and get into abortion procedures. So there are two types of abortion procedures. Okay. There are chemical abortions and then there are surgical abortions. Okay. So all of these methods of abortion that I'm about to describe to you are currently legal in at least some places in the United States. Okay. So I'm not going to, creating any straw men here. These are legal procedures, but let's go ahead and get into chemical abortions. So the first one I want to talk about is mifepristone, or RU486. This is otherwise known as the abortion pill. So I'm going to be reading these to you because it's a little bit, specific to, I want to be specific to the medical side of what these things are. So mifepristone blocks the hormone that helps develop the lining of the uterus during pregnancy, progesterone. This lining is a source of nutrition and protection for the developing baby. The baby is starved to death, and then a second drug, misoprostol, causes contractions so that the dead baby is expelled from the womb. So when people talk about the abortion pill, the thing that they're trying to put in like vending machines in the state of California, that's mifepristone. That's what people are talking about. Okay. Then we have methotrexate. This highly toxic chemical directly attacks and breaks down the baby's fast-growing cells. It also attacks the life support systems the baby needs to survive. When the systems fail, the baby dies. Misoprostol is then used to cause contractions to push the dead baby out of the womb. Okay. Then we have salt poisoning. This technique is used in the second and third trimesters. The abortionist sticks a long needle into the mother's womb. The needle contains salt, which is then injected into the amniotic fluid surrounding the baby. The baby breathes in, swallows the salt, and dies from salt poisoning, dehydration, brain hemorrhage, and convulsions. Taking nearly an hour to die, the baby's skin is completely burned, turns red, and deteriorates. The baby is in pain the entire time. The mother goes into labor 24 to 48 hours later and delivers a dead baby. And the last chemical one that we're going to be talking about here is called prostaglandins. So this is used during the second and third trimester. Prostaglandin abortions involve the injection of naturally produced hormones into the amniotic sac, causing violent premature labor. During these convulsions, the baby is often crushed to death or is born too early to have any chance of surviving. So there you go. Those are chemical abortions that are legal here in the United States of America. But now let's move on to surgical abortions. So in terms of surgical abortions, there's basically what I'm going to call the 3 Ds. And so that's dilation and curettage, otherwise known as D and C, dilation and evacuation, otherwise known as D and E, and then dilation and extraction, otherwise known as D and X. So let's go ahead and talk about dilation and curettage, otherwise known as D and C. So essentially what happens here is the abortionist inserts a suction tube or a suction catheter into the uterus, right? The suction machine is then turned on, and this suction machine is incredibly powerful. It's like 10 to 20 times the power of what you would have in like a household vacuum cleaner, okay? And so the suction tube basically rapidly tears apart the preborn child. Right, so just tears it into pieces because it's so powerful. The body of the child and the placenta, they are basically squeezed through this tube and down into the suction machine and basically into a trash can. The leftover parts, because this is not an exact science, in terms of sucking the baby out like that, the leftover parts then and the placenta, the leftover parts of the child and the placenta, rather, they can lead to infection or bleeding inside the mother. So basically, they take this tool called a curette and they go in and they scrape the lining of the uterus, which can cause a tremendous amount of damage to the woman, even though it's already caused deadly damage to the child. But they basically scrape the lining of the uterus to make sure the rest of the baby parts and the placenta have come out. Okay, so that's dilation and curettage, D&C. But now let's talk about dilation and evacuation. Okay, this is D&E. This is a very, very common second trimester abortion. So basically a Sofer clamp. So if you think about Sofer clamp, this is something that when you clamp it onto something, it's meant to pull. It's meant to, it has teeth so that things can't be taken away from its grasp, essentially. So a Sofer clamp is inserted into the uterus and the abortionist starts looking around for arms or legs. It's looking for limbs to rip off. So one by one, the limbs of the baby are actually removed violently. They are ripped off of the body of the baby. So the abortionist then removes the spine. It removes any other, the hearts and lungs, any of the other intestines. It's basically removing things from the center abdomen of the child. But the hardest part, most difficult part about this particular abortion for the abortionist is getting the skull out. Okay, because the skull is not big enough at this point to get through that area. The body hasn't opened up the vaginal canal so that the head can come out easily. So what they do is they essentially insert that clamp again and the head is grasped and then they crush it. They crush it into pieces so that they can pull it out piece by piece. And then just like with a D&C, there's a curette that is used to scrape the lining of the uterus to remove any other parts. And then this is kind of the horrible, horrific thing. Essentially what they do to make sure they've gotten all the pieces of the baby out, because again, with a D&E, this is a pretty much a fully formed baby when this is being done that just needs to grow a little bit more. They will actually piece it together like this, macabre puzzle on the table to make sure they have all the pieces of the baby because, we only have one arm. We need to go back in and scrape some more because I think the other arm was left in there. So that's basically a D&E. Then we have a DNX. So a DNX, a dilation and extraction, that's a partial birth abortion. Okay. So the thing about this particular procedure is this procedure is still legal in the United States. Okay. And now some people might automatically say, well, what about, the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act of 2007? That's something that people commonly know about. That was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. The thing about this is how a DNX typically happens is they will pull the baby out by its feet. They will leave the head inside of the vaginal canal, basically inside the woman. They will make an incision on the back of the baby's neck with scissors or a really sharp tool, and then they will jam a suction tube into the baby's brain. They will suck the brains out while the head is still inside the woman. And then once that has happened, once the baby has been murdered, they're going to pull the rest of the baby out and then essentially throw it in a trash can. Okay. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought partial birth abortions were banned now, but it's very, very easy for doctors to get around the Partial Birth Abortion Act of 2007. Essentially, doctors can avoid breaking the law by first injecting the fetus with a lethal intracardiac toxin, okay? And this kills the baby before they pull it out, okay? So essentially, they're doing a partial birth abortion, but beforehand, they're just injecting the baby with some horrible toxin that kills them. Now, I will say this just as a generic side note. I'm sure when I described a partial birth abortion or a DNX, that made some of you very, very uncomfortable, right? It bothered you way more than when I was describing a DNC or a DNE, okay? And that is evidence of a seared conscience, okay? Because late-term abortions, let's just be real, late-term abortions aren't more wrong or more barbaric than other abortions. They're just messier, right? They're just more disgusting. They're just more ooey and icky and gooey. That's essentially what those things are. But also, if you listen to this podcast for any length of time, you remember what I talked about on episode 221, keeping babies alive just long enough to harvest their organs. And that's post-birth abortions. So go to episode 221 if you want a super deep dive. I'll make sure that link is in the show notes as well, or you can just scroll until you get to episode 221. But this was information that was gathered by the Center for Medical Progress. And it was talking about how the University of Pittsburgh is getting taxpayer money, U.S. taxpayer money, to harvest the organs of unborn and born babies. Okay. So as of right now, the latest data I could find is they've received $2.7 million worth of U.S. taxpayer funding of the $3.2 million that they applied for. Okay. So the doctors and scientists at the University of Pittsburgh are doing what they can to essentially keep babies alive longer after they have been removed from their mothers so that they can more effectively harvest their organs so that they can profit from it. Okay. So the university is targeting fetuses, from 6 weeks of gestation all the way up to 42 weeks of gestation. So this program is, disproportionately targeting Black babies, which is something that a lot of people should, rightfully be, up in arms and crazy about. But this is being done so that multiple parties, right, not just the university, but so that multiple different parties can profit from the sale of these parts. Okay. So there's actually a key quote from this press release that I want to get into here. And it's that if the fetus's heartbeat and blood circulation continue in a labor induction abortion for harvesting organs, it means the fetus is being delivered while still alive. And the cause of death is the removal of the organs. So the translation of this is most of these babies are murdered via abortion while the others are murdered after they've been born, aka infanticide. But the reality is they're being killed because their organs are being removed. So think about this. These babies are alive. They are 100% alive. And what is killing them is the fact that their organs are being removed while they're still alive. Think about that in a context of, a child that you have, or think about that in the context of yourself or something like that. Imagine being killed by having your organs removed. It's like some sort of dystopian novel, right? But here's the big point. Why did I spend so much time going into, surgical abortions and chemical abortions and all those different things? This is the main point and the big point that I want you to get from me describing that. Okay. It's not just to be needlessly, grotesque. The big point is that the baby feels these abortions when they happen. The baby feels pain. Okay. We have an overwhelming amount of data that says that a baby feels pain inside the womb at 12 weeks. Okay. But you might be saying, well, didn't some of the stuff you described happen before 12 weeks? There is some circumstantial data, and there's some data that is yet to be corroborated. And there's probably a reason behind that would suggest that a baby can feel pain way earlier than 12 weeks. We're talking maybe even like 5-6 weeks of gestation before many women even realize that they're pregnant. And the way they do that is they will actually, if they need like a blood sample or something like that, and they need to prick the heel of the baby to get a blood sample or something like that, the baby will actually recoil from that stimulus. Okay. And they wouldn't recoil if it was a neutral stimulus. They're recoiling because the pain is being felt and they're reacting to it. So when you think about these abortions, think about you being sucked through a suction tube, right? And ripped into pieces. Think about you being, just kind of chilling there and someone getting this big tool, this big grasping tool, and ripping off your limbs one by one and then crushing your head and being able to feel all that, because that's what the baby in the womb feels. But guys, now we're going to get into really the meat and potatoes of what we're going to go through today, and that's engaging pro-abortion arguments. This is so incredibly important because, again, I've talked to Christians, I talked to people that would consider themselves to be card-carrying pro-life members, right? Like that's just who they are. And then they get one bit of pushback, and then all of a sudden they're like, well, I never really thought about it that way. I guess we can kill babies in certain circumstances. And it's absolutely absurd, but that's why we're here to equip you. But the first part that I want to give you is a lot of people really complicate the pro-life argument, but I want to keep it simple. Okay. Let's keep the pro-life argument very, very simple. So Matt Walsh actually put this in a book, and we're talking to the authors here in about a month. And so you'll be able to learn more about that. It's called What to Say When. It's by the guys that run 40 Days for Life. But he wrote the foreword for that book, Matt Walsh did. And this is how he, encapsulates what the pro-abortion argument is. Other people have done this, but I'm using his words specifically. It's two parts. Part one, abortion intentionally and directly destroys innocent human life. Part two, it is always wrong to intentionally and directly destroy innocent human life. That is the pro-life argument. It is that simple. Okay, so I'll just say it again as one statement. Abortion intentionally and directly destroys innocent human life. It is always wrong to intentionally and directly destroy innocent human life. Okay. So again, before we get into each one of these individual arguments, because I'm going to basically throw out, here's the argument, here's the reality to that argument, and then I'm going to give you some things that you can say in response. But as a side note, pro-abortion people see Christians and conservatives as easy targets. Well, we are such easy targets for them because we're so nice. And this is just one of those issues that we can't just be nice about this issue, right? That doesn't mean you have to be a jerk about this issue, but we can't just be nice. We have to go on the offensive without being needlessly offensive, if that makes sense. Because this isn't an agree to disagree scenario, right? There's a reality to what's going on with the abortion procedure and to whom it's happening to, right? And again, I say this all the time. I'll say it till I'm blue in the face, but a lot of Christians and conservatives never find a hill worth dying on. And at some point, they wake up and realize that the war has passed them by. It is now over and they've lost. They've never picked up their helmet. They never put on their shield. They never took up their sword, and the war is over. This is going to be one of those areas where we're going to draw a line in the sand. And if you're going to be a Christian, if you're going to, claim to have a discipleship relationship with Jesus Christ, you cannot in any way, shape, or form be pro-abortion. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the first thing here. We're going to talk about arguments from the Bible because we have to start, where do we even get our foundation for the reason why we shouldn't just slaughter people at random? Okay, so here's what the Bible has to say about the kind of the area of abortion. We'll start with Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Okay, so that is the basis for the Imago Dei. That is the basis for how we get people to look at other people as someone created in the image of God is Genesis 1:27. And then I'll go ahead and repeat Jeremiah 1:5 that I said from the top of the podcast. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. And then Psalm 139:13-16 is similar to it. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you. When I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. So guys, that is the basis for why we are so anti what's happening with abortion. Because we see there in scripture, and there are other places as well, that we have the Imago Dei. We have the image of God written on us, on our souls from the moment that we come into being. More on that here in just a second. But also, while we're developing in the womb, we have value to God. So that's the basis of the biblical argument for why we should be against abortion. But there are a lot of people that don't want to hear anything about the Bible. They look at the Bible as just this collection of writings by these old patriarchal men, that wrote these things down, and it's been passed down over time. And oh man, it's been translated so many different times that we just can't trust it. And oh, that's just, something from a bygone era. So there are people that won't even listen to you when it comes to biblical arguments. So we need to still tell these people biblical truths. We still need to stand on the foundations of the gospel. But at the same time, a lot of people want to hear arguments from science, logic, and reasoning. So we've got that covered as well. Now, if you're going to enter into a conversation or a debate with somebody that's talking about the subject of abortion and they are pro-abortion and you're arguing from science, logic, and reasoning or whatever, one thing that you should expect is that the pro-abortion person is going to constantly jump around. They're going to go to different arguments and topics, during this discussion. You have to be ready to do that because here's the deal. They have to do this because their position is the one that's untenable. When they start losing on one particular topic, as you'll see here in a second, I'm going to very easily lay it out for you, how you can destroy the majority of their arguments. The moment they start losing, they're going to move the goalposts. They're going to start looking somewhere else. So let's go and dive in. Here's one of the first arguments you see. We don't know when life begins. We don't know when life begins. But the reality of this is we do know when life begins. We do know that. And here's the thing. Many pro-lifers will say something like, I believe that life begins at conception. I believe that it begins at conception. We need to stop saying this. And I'm guilty of it as well. I've said that. I've said that even recently. I believe life begins at conception. But again, we don't believe it. We know it. We know it to be true. So I'm going to go through some quotes here that kind of prove this point. This quote is from a guy named Dr. Jerome Lejeune. So he is a world-renowned scientist and physician. He's also been given the nickname the father of modern genetics. Okay. So this guy absolutely knows what he's talking about when it comes to embryology. Okay. Here's a quote from him. Quote, "The fact that after fertilization has taken place, a new human has come into being is no longer a matter of taste or opinion. It is plain experimental evidence," unquote. So that's from the father of modern genetics. But let's go ahead and get into some stuff as well. I found some stuff from a 1988 embryology textbook. Okay, so this is the Essentials of Human Embryology, and this was written by Keith Moore. Here's a quote from that. Quote, "Human development begins after the union of a male and female gametes or germ cells during a process known as fertilization, conception. Fertilization is a sequence of events that begins with the contact of a sperm, the spermatozoon, with a secondary oocyte, the ovum, and ends with the fusion of their pronuclei, the haploid nuclei of the sperm and the ovum, and the mingling of their chromosomes to form a new cell. This fertilized ovum, known as a zygote, is a large diploid cell that is the beginning or primordium of a human being," unquote. Okay. And guys, just so you don't think I'm cherry picking from some just random things, there was a 2018 academic study done. So very, very recently by the University of Chicago, there was a researcher named Dr. Stephen Jacobs, and they found that 95% of biologists affirm that life begins at fertilization. 95%. Okay. And the other 5% weren't presenting any otherworldly earth-shattering data to suggest why they didn't believe that it started then. And in that 95% cohort, that included supermajorities of scientists who self-identify as pro-choice or liberal. Okay. They absolutely identify in that way. So I want to put this very, very simply. To say that the fetus isn't alive, which is what some people are going to argue, to say that it's not alive from the moment that it's a one-celled zygote is just ridiculous. Because we know things about what's happening with the fetus. The fetus is growing, cell division is taking place, the unborn baby is processing nutrition. There are a lot of things happening inside there, and none of those biological processes happen in a non-living entity. None of them. Like a rock doesn't do those things. A microphone doesn't do those things. A water bottle doesn't do those things. The bottom line is, scientifically speaking, life begins at conception, right at conception, period. Okay, so I'm going to give you some ideas, and just so you know, with a lot of these arguments, something I should have mentioned from the very top here. I haven't just made up a lot of these arguments. Some of these things have kind of come from my brain, but there are some books I'm going to talk about here at the end that I've gotten a lot of these ideas from. So I've already mentioned one, What to Say When by the guys over at 40 Days for Life. There's a abortion book by R.C. Sproul. There's a lot of arguments that I've gotten from other pro-life people, but I'm kind of coalescing these things down so that it's practical for you. So, but when people are talking about this particular issue and they're saying, hey, we don't know when life begins, here's how you should respond. And on all these responses, I'm going to give you questions to ask them. Because the way that you go on the offensive is you need to put the person you're talking to, your opponent, if you will, on their heels. Because again, their position is the one that's not tenable. So we need to just pound these positions so that we can destroy them. Okay. So this is how I would respond to that is, do you think we can know when life begins? Do you think it's knowable when life begins? And if they say yes, just ask them, how would we go about finding out when life begins? Because that's going to give you a very, very good idea where they land on this issue. Because they're going to tell you, well, this is how we can figure it out. Or maybe they don't actually mean that. Maybe they don't think it's actually knowable. So that's a very, very good way to deal with that particular pushback. Now, the next argument that you'll hear is it's not a human life. It's just potential life. It's just a clump of cells. Now, the reality of that is we are all clumps of cells. We're not just clumps of cells, but we are all clumps of cells, even today. We just happen to be much bigger clumps of cells than the babies that are growing in the womb. That's the only difference, okay? So how I would respond to someone that says, hey, it's just a clump of cells, because that's something that you do hear quite often. The first question I would ask that person is, what do you mean by potential life? What do you mean by potential life? That's going to give you a really good idea as to what they mean by the words potential and what they mean by the words life. As we just described, we know scientifically that life begins at conception. We know that biblically as well. What do you mean by potential life? But then here's another thing, and this is a great way to look at it, is they say, okay, it's just a clump of cells. You can respond by saying, are the cells living? Are they living cells? Again, that's not an opinion answer. That's either yes or no. And the correct answer, biologically speaking, is yes. They are living cells. So they have to answer yes. And when they answer yes, you ask them this follow-up. What species of cells are they? Because we're arguing that these are living humans. Like, are they arguing that they're a living ficus or a living Volkswagen or living any other species of anything on the planet? So are the cells living? The answer is yes. What species are they? What species of cells are they? Human. So they are living human cells. And then I guess the last thing that you could say, and this is just a general way to respond to somebody that's making this argument, is, okay, so when does life begin? When does life begin? Now, for a lot of people, they kind of have their ways that they're going to answer that, and they're going to go up and down with it, but you just got to put them in a corner. They have to answer the question. They say, oh, it's just a clump of cells. It's not a living anything. Okay, well, then when does life begin? Put them on their heels. The next argument I'm going to go through here is it's not a human being. It's a parasite. Now, I'm sure you've heard something like that, but the reality when someone says that is this person doesn't know what a parasite is, okay? Because the thing is a parasite definitionally is an organism that is different, that is a different species from its host. It's not the same as its host. There's no such thing as a human parasite onto another human. Now, some people in your life might feel that way, but that's not really what we're talking about here at this point. There's no such thing as an intra-species parasite, right? There's not a mule parasite for a mule kind of a thing like that. Those things don't happen. So how I would respond to somebody that says it's not a human being, it's a parasite, is I would ask them this question. Can you please explain to me what a parasite is? Because again, they're making a biological declaration that, oh, it's just a parasite. What is a parasite? Get them to define it for you, right? And another way that I respond to another question is, when does it biologically turn from being a parasite to a human being? Because again, they can't escape this question. They're saying it's not a human being when it's in the womb. It's just a parasite just sucking life off the mother. Okay, great. When does it turn from a parasite into a human being? And again, we're going to get into some of those arguments because I'm sure you've already thought about some of the responses, but that's a very, very important question that you have to get them to answer. It's because they're claiming that it's biologically something different in the womb than what it really is. Peg them on it, make them say it. All right, the next one that a lot of people will say is it's not a person until it's viable. Okay, it's not a person until it's viable. But the reality is the viability argument crumbles under its own weight. It has to. Okay, so this is how I would respond to this. If someone says it's not a person until it's viable. Are you aware that many babies are able to survive and thrive outside the womb at 21 weeks of gestation? Are you aware of that? Because we have a lot of cases of babies as young as 21 weeks. Again, typically a baby is around 40, 41 weeks before they're born, right? At 21 weeks, half that time, they're able to survive and thrive outside the womb. It's not a tremendously high percentage of those babies across the globe that can be saved, but it's certainly possible. We have the technology to do that. They probably weren't aware of that. That's why you should ask them. Another question I would ask is, what about the babies that are killed after the point of viability? Because they're saying, again, this is their argument, it's not a person until they're viable. Well, they're viable around 21 weeks. So what about the babies that are killed in abortions after 21 weeks? Are those wrong? As the level of technology increases and the level of gestation lowers in terms of what we can do to save a baby, like, does that change your opinion? So if 10 years from now, a baby can survive outside the womb at 19 weeks, is it now inappropriate and morally wrong for us to kill a baby after that point? Right? Because in the past few decades, we've shaved, I think, like 5 or 6 weeks off of the viability of a baby. Used to, they couldn't survive outside the womb if they were earlier than 27, 28 weeks. Now it's 21. So you just got to ask them, what do we do with those babies that are killed after then? What are those? What happens then? And the last question I would maybe ask to someone like this is it fair to say that you believe that you cannot be a person worthy of protection until you're viable? And this is an important one. This is the one that's going to hit them right in the butt, and they have no idea. They have no freaking clue. Because the reality is if they believe this, that's not a person until it's viable, you've got to get them to admit that that person is not worthy of protection. And then you ask them some follow-up questions. Like, is a newborn baby viable? Is someone that's 2 weeks old outside the womb, is that a viable human being? Or do they require a lot of help in order to survive? Is a toddler, my wife and I have a toddler right now. He's not viable, but you have to ask them that. Is a toddler viable? Can they live on their own? Or do they need help? And then throw it way to the other side of the spectrum. Is an elderly person on life support or somebody with a tremendous disability viable? They have machines keeping them alive. That's definitionally not viable. But the overall reason why you would ask them these questions, guys, is if you apply the standard, whatever the standard is, if you apply any of these arguments to a baby in the womb, you also have to apply it to humans of any age. Because if you apply that standard to a living human being, which we've already established in the womb, why would you not also apply that to a 3-week-old, to a 12-year-old, to an 80-year-old? Again, it doesn't wash when you're talking about this from a logical standpoint. Okay? It's not rational. Let's go to the other arguments that you hear a lot of. Here's one. It's not a person until it's sentient. It's not a person until it's sentient. The reality is the sentience argument, just like the viability argument, crumbles under its own weight. Okay. So the definition of sentience, because that's not a normal word that we use in modern parlance for the most part, it's the ability to perceive one's environment and experience sensations such as pain and suffering or pleasure and comfort. Okay. So this is how I would respond to someone saying, it's not a human until it's sentient. Is I would ask them, what does sentience mean? Because if you're going to make the sentience argument, you better know what it means. So that's the first one. The second thing I would ask them is, if you're in a coma, this is the Ben Shapiro argument that you've probably heard. If you're in a coma from which you might awake, would it be okay if I killed you? Because when you're sleeping, you're technically still sentient, but when you're in a coma, you're not sentient. You're just not. You can't perceive your environment. You can't experience sensations like pain or suffering or pleasure or comfort. Like, you're in a coma. So you're saying that they're not human when they're not sentient. So you should be okay if I were to kill people that were in comas. If I walked into hospitals right now and just started picking off people that were in comas, you should feel completely okay with that. No big deal. And then the last thing that I would say or add to that, which really kind of drives home that point even further, is if you have a mental disorder, would it be okay if I killed you? Because there are a lot of people that have mental disorders that significantly have altered views of their own environment, which again gets back to the definition of what sentience is. So if you have a mental disorder, would you be okay if I killed you? Would that be okay? Again, these people, you're putting them in the seat of someone that's going to have their life taken. They're not going to be very comfortable with that. Again, if you apply the standard to a baby in the womb, you also have to apply it to a human of any age. You're saying that the baby inside the womb is not sentient, right? Which also isn't true, because they do feel pain. They feel these different stimuli. They feel trauma at the same time. Again, you have to put them on their heels. Another argument that you'll get is it's not a person until it's born, okay? It's not a person until it's born. The reality is this argument has no foundation whatsoever. Not in biology, not in theology, not in reality, nothing. This is how I would respond to someone that says it's not a person until it's born. Does the vaginal canal confer personhood? In other words, does the vaginal canal create a person? Like what's magical about the vaginal canal, right? From a birth standpoint. And then I would also ask them a question like this. What is it just before it enters the vaginal canal? Because you're saying it's not a person until it's born. So right before it's about to crown, right before it's going to come out of the woman's body, what is it then? They've got to answer that question. That's a very, very important thing that they have to reckon with. And then the last one I would ask here is, would it be fair to say that you are 100% in support of abortion up to the moment of birth? And this is where you're putting them on their heels, because now you're bringing up late-term abortion. You're bringing up 40, 41, 42-week abortions, right? The baby can live anywhere on the planet. It's just currently residing inside the belly of the woman, right? Because you say if it's not a person until it's born, and they can't define what exactly it is before it's born, then you should be okay with abortion at that point, right? Next one here that a lot of people talk about is abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, right? So I think that was coined back in the Clinton administration, with Bill and Hillary Clinton, safe, legal, and rare. But the reality of that, that's argument is not made nearly as much anymore. It's, abortion for any reason, for whatever reason, and you should pay for it. But the reality of that statement is a useless slogan. It's absolutely useless. Safe, legal, and rare. Let's go ahead and talk about each one of those. So the first one is safe. This is how I would respond. Is the abortion safe for the baby or the fetus? Whatever you want to say. Fetus is just Latin for offspring, right? Is the abortion safe for the baby? The only answer for that is no. Of course it's not. Let's talk about legal. If abortion is morally neutral, why do we need to have laws around it? That makes no sense at all. We don't need to have laws around abortion if it's just a morally neutral thing. And then last thing, rare. Why should abortions be rare? Why should they be rare? Abortion is the most common surgery on the planet, but we don't say that other surgeries should be rare. I think the second most common surgery is gallbladder surgery. Would you say that needs to be rare? Hip replacements need to be rare? Removing a mole that could be cancerous, should that be rare? You wouldn't say those things, because the reality is, guys, is either the fetus is not a human person and has no moral significance whatsoever, or they are an innocent human person whose life we cannot justify taking. Those are the only two options. And imagine, and this is from the What to Say When book. I thought this was great. Imagine saying, yeah, Africans are human persons, so we should only subject them to slavery in rare occasions. Safe, legal, and rare. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense. But a lot of people say it. Let's move on to the next one here. What about if abortion is necessary to save the life or health of the mother? You hear that one a lot. Usually people will scream it. So that's why you get it with an exclamation point and a question mark. But the reality is, and this is huge, abortion is never medically necessary to save the life of the mother. Never medically necessary. And this gives a lot of people pause. Even on the pro-life side, they're like, wait a minute. I thought abortion was necessary to save the woman's life. I thought that was like a common thing that most people knew. No, not the case. But people will bring up cancer, ovarian cancer, stuff like that. They'll bring up preeclampsia. They'll bring up chorioamnionitis, right? Which is like, it's the amniotic fluid getting an infection, right? It could be potentially deadly for baby and mom. Then you hear a lot of people talk about tubular or ectopic pregnancies, but there's a reality here. So let's go back to cancer. Ovarian cancer is talked about a lot. Killing the baby via abortion only delays mother's cancer treatment. Because if you go through the process of putting her through the surgery of killing her baby, you could have been giving her treatment for that cancer at that point. Because the reality is you can actually receive treatment with baby still in the womb. With what we're able to do now with, kind of pinpointing accuracy in terms of what we can do with cancer treatments. We've even seen, I talked about this before on the podcast over in the UK, they actually removed a womb from a woman's body during surgery so that they could, I think they were removing cancer from her abdomen area. They put the womb back, sewed her up, and the baby's alive today. We have the medical capabilities of pulling these things off. So you don't have to kill the baby to get rid of the cancer. And then when you talk about preeclampsia, preeclampsia, it happens usually after 20 weeks of gestation, right? That's when preeclampsia typically happens. So in those instances, you don't have to kill the baby to save mom. You just deliver baby. It's like, oh, I've got a 25-week-old fetus, but I have preeclampsia. Okay, let's kill the baby so that we can treat my preeclampsia. That makes no sense. You just deliver the baby, okay? Then you have chorioamnionitis, which I've described. Again, you don't have to kill the baby to save mom. You just deliver the baby to take care of the chorioamnionitis. But then the last one where a lot of people kind of get, pulled up on is tubular or ectopic pregnancies. So the reality about tubular or ectopic pregnancies, that's basically where the baby doesn't make it out of the fallopian tube. It gets stuck in the fallopian tube. This is very, very dangerous, okay? But in around 93% of ectopic pregnancies, there is not a fetus in the fallopian tube, okay? It's human parts that have kind of fallen apart. It's not an intact fetus. The fetus has already died by the time the ectopic pregnancy has been diagnosed, right? That's almost 100% of cases, okay? But for those where that doesn't happen that way, the reality is that the baby cannot survive without being moved from the fallopian tube to the uterus. The baby simply can't survive. It cannot grow in the fallopian tube. It needs to be implanted in the uterus, okay? But currently, and unfortunately, there are no standard practices around this procedure, okay? It'd be great if we, took, the $500 million we give to Planned Parenthood every year and put it into this area. Like, hey, on an ectopic pregnancy, if we find it, how can we actually move the baby from the fallopian tube into the uterus? There have actually been doctors that have pulled that off before. They were able to flush the baby into the uterus. It's incredible. But again, there's no standards around that. But again, we have to go back to this. We have to go back when you're talking about all these different things, because how you deal with an ectopic pregnancy normally is you take the fallopian tube out, which kills the baby. But again, here's the argument. Part one, abortion intentionally and directly destroys innocent human life. Okay? And then part two was it's always wrong to intentionally and directly destroy innocent human life. But if you're doing surgery for an ectopic pregnancy, you are not intentionally and directly destroying innocent human life. That is a byproduct of what you're doing to save mom's life. Okay? The intent of surgical intervention or surgically intervening for an ectopic pregnancy is not to kill the baby. It is an unfortunate byproduct of trying to save mom. That's the reality. Okay. The doctor is trying to save 2 lives when they're treating a mother for any of those reasons that I talked about earlier, any of those ailments. They're trying to treat both people because both people want to survive, right? If given their options. And so that's what the doctor's there to do. So this is how I would respond to somebody that says it's medically necessary for some women to get an abortion. I would ask them this: are you aware that abortion is never medically necessary to save the life of the mother? Because you are going to get the craziest look, because they're going to be like, this dude is crazy. This dude is absolutely nuts. Because obviously it's a well-known fact that abortion is necessary in some cases. It's simply not. I would also ask them this: if the woman's life or health, I'm using air quotes, is at risk, air quotes again, after birth, can we murder the child then too? Because a lot of people talk about the health of the mother. They're not talking about her life. They're talking about the health of the mother, which doesn't just stay in the physical realm. They extend that to emotional health, financial health, relational health, right? So that's why I say they're at risk, right? But what about after birth? Can we murder the child then? You're throwing this back in their face, right? Because they'll say things like, you only care about the life and health of the mother while she's pregnant. You don't give a crap after. Well, let's talk about after. The kid's 2 years old, and that kid staying alive is going to affect this woman's health because she just wants to kill this little thing, right? It won't shut up. It won't do what she says. It keeps crapping itself. Why can't we kill it then? Because you're saying this is necessary to protect the health of the mother. Her mental health is important. Can we kill her 2-year-old? Throw it back in their face. And then I'll go ahead and throw this in at the end here. Another question you could ask them is, since concern for the mother's health only accounts for around 4% of all abortions, are the other roughly 96% of abortions morally wrong? Again, they'll be shocked to realize that around 4% of abortions are potentially because the mother's health is at risk. They probably think it's way higher than that, probably 10 times higher or more. But then you have to ask them, okay, we can talk about those 4%. We'll put those over here. What about the 96% of all the other abortions? Are those morally wrong? Got to get an answer to that. Here's another one. This is one of my personal favorites. No uterus, no opinion. So if you're a guy, you can't have an opinion or an abortion, right? The reality of that is this is intellectually dishonest because they're okay with the opinions of pro-choice males. I mean, duh. They love your opinion if you agree with them. Most people would say that. Oh, you agree with me. I like your opinion. Oh, you disagree with me? You probably shouldn't be able to have one. So the fact is it was an all-male Supreme Court that legalized abortion in 1973, right? The overwhelming majority of abortions that take place in the United States are done by abortion doctors that are male, right? The overwhelming majority of abortion facilities are owned by men. Most of the politicians that pass and enforce pro-abortion laws are men. It's rife with men that think you should be pro-choice, otherwise known as pro-abortion. So this is outright discrimination against humans with Y chromosomes, otherwise known as males, that disagree with them. That's what this is. Every human being should be absolutely entitled to their opinion on any issue, regardless of how potentially inflammatory it is. Okay. So this is how I would respond to someone that says no uterus, no opinion. I would ask them this: what about the millions of women that agree with me? There are roughly more women in the pro-life cause than there are men. That's unfortunate, but it's true. So what about the millions that agree with me? You're saying my opinion sucks, but we share the same opinion, those women and me. So what's the difference? I would also ask them this, and this is not meant to be tongue in cheek. This is meant to be literal. Don't even smile when you say it. If I identify as a woman for the remainder of our conversation, do I get to have an opinion then? Because now you're attacking a worldview, a foundational part of this person's worldview. Because again, painting with a broad brush here, but if you're pro-choice, otherwise known as pro-abortion, you're probably okay with the rest of, the LGBTQ plus array of thinking, that worldview. So make them be the bigot and say, hey, look, I'd like to identify as a woman for the remainder of our conversation. So is it okay for me to have an opinion now? Now, that's pretty ballsy to kind of go there. That does kind of poke at their worldview, which may or may not go well for you, but that is something that you can say. But now we're going to get into the subject, or really the argument that you hear the most often. This is the one that you most often hear from people that are pro-abortion. My body, my choice. My body, my choice. But there's a reality here. This is very, very important. Abortion destroys a completely separate body. Abortion destroys a completely separate body. Because guys, I talked about earlier, if you need a blood or tissue sample from the fetus, it has to come from the fetus. Like you don't take a blood sample from mom in order to get a blood sample for the baby. Why? Because it's a separate body with its own blood. From the time it's a one-celled zygote, it has its own DNA. It develops its own organs, its own skin, its own fingerprints, its own fingernails, its own everything inside its own body from the time it's a one-celled zygote. At that moment, we know how tall you're going to be. You're not going to change. We know what eye color you're going to have. The coarseness of your hair, the hair color, all those things are known at that exact moment that you're a one-celled zygote. All that information is there. So you've probably heard the old adage by now, which is, my right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. You probably heard something similar to that. That still applies to the living human that's in the womb. It 100% still applies because basically your right to choose what you do with your body ends where that other human body begins. Okay. So the reason for that is this. This is why. This is really, really important. The abortion does not happen to the woman. It does not happen to her. It happens to the living human that's inside her womb. Okay. Again, I thought the book What to Say When really broke this down really, really well. The abortion impacts the woman's body secondarily. Okay. The primary impact of the abortion is to the baby's body inside the womb. The woman's body is simply the setting for the abortion, which seems like a really, terse way of putting it, but it's true because the heart that is stopped in an abortion, a successful abortion, if you will, is not the mother's heart. It's the baby's heart. The limbs that are torn off or are sucked out with a suction tube, they're not the woman's. They're not the mom's. It's the baby's. The brains that are sucked out through a tube into a trash can, right? It's not the woman's brains. At the end of a successful abortion, right? Which is a horrible way of saying it, right? The only lifeless body that's left after the abortion is that of the baby's, not the mother's. The mother doesn't die. So when people say my body, my choice, they have to reckon with that. So this is how I would respond to them is in what other domain of society is that true? My body, my choice. Because again, if you decide to stop your car in the middle of the highway and pull your clothes off and stand up on the top of your car naked and dance, you're going to get arrested for that, right? It's not my body, my choice. If you walk into a random, children's cafeteria and start punching people, you can't say my body, my choice. That doesn't make a lot of sense. You can't gain access into a place or a secure area, that you're not allowed to have access to and just say, hey, my body, my choice. That doesn't make any sense. It's a silly, ridiculous argument. But then the last thing that I would say to someone that says my body, my choice is, are you saying that the fetus inside the woman is the woman? Or is that a separate human being? You have to get them to admit to that because then they're probably going to back into the parasite argument. They're like, yeah, okay, it might be a separate thing, but it's leeching off the mother. So it's not really even real. It's not, you can't protect something like that. It's a parasite, right? Again, they're going to move the goalpost. So you have to be ready for that, but you have to ask the question anyway. Another argument you'll get is, do you think that you can force women to reproduce? Do you think you can just force women to reproduce? It'll be something like that. But the reality is from the moment of conception, reproduction has already occurred. People talk about these things like, oh, you're forced reproduction. That's ridiculous. That's Handmaid's Tale. That's not what this is. Everyone's against that because that's called sex slavery. That's what little girls are being sold into right now in Afghanistan and all over the world, frankly. But from the moment of conception, reproduction has already taken place. It's already happened. A new life is now in the world, taking up space, brand new. So this is how I would respond to this person. What do you mean by reproduce? What do you mean by reproduce? Because again, they're not understanding the fact that this is a living human being now. You can't just get rid of it. Another argument you'll hear from people is, what about in cases of rape and incest? This is a big time argument for them. This is their ace of spades argument. And one just quick aside before we get into the reality is, if they bring this up, if they bring up rape and incest, you're really close to winning the debate. Just hang in the pocket. Just hang in because it's almost over. Because this is a 100% emotional Hail Mary appeal, right? They don't realize it maybe, but that's exactly what it is. Because the reality is that the abortion does not erase the rape. It only adds a trauma. That's what abortion does. So I've seen people talk about this before, women that have gotten abortions, right? Because they felt like they had no other options. They have an anniversary date for their rape. Every year when that date comes up, they're reminded of the fact that they were raped. But when they got an abortion to get rid of the baby that was conceived during rape, there's an anniversary for that now too. So the anniversary of their rape reminds them of their abortion. And the anniversary of their abortion will now remind them of their rape. These women are haunted by it, okay? They're absolutely haunted by it. And then people want to change the subject and be like, well, what about the rapists and what about all those different things? And again, they're not going to really like my answer to that because I think that we are way too lenient in our punishments for rape, way too lenient. For me personally, if you're convicted of rape beyond a reasonable doubt and after appeal and all those different things, you should be castrated and then killed. We don't use the death penalty for rape in the United States. I have no idea why. Castrated and killed. Get them out of here. Get them out of the population. And if that's going to be too expensive, take them outside of town, shoot them in the head, leave their body there for their families to gather if they want to get it. That's what we should do to rapists. Okay? But the child's dignity, the child that's in the womb, is not tied to how we're conceived. So if you're conceived in a loving home, right, between two doting parents and you're the third child, that's no different than someone that was, conceived in a violent rape. The child's dignity isn't tied to that. So this is how I would respond to people that say, what about in the cases of rape and incest? I would ask them this. Do you think that an abortion erases a rape? Because obviously the answer is no, but you have to get their answer to that. Do you think, that an abortion gets rid of the rape as if the rape never happened? Because that's not reality. The next question I would ask, or another question I would ask, is do you think that rapists like abortion? Do you think they like abortion? Because the answer to that is absolutely. Rapists love abortion. Because in a lot of cases, getting rid of the baby inside of the woman that they raped and impregnated is getting rid of all the evidence that they even did the rape. They freaking love it. It's like their favorite thing. Another question I would ask is, are you comfortable with children getting the death penalty for something that their fathers did? Because people don't normally frame it like that when they're talking about rape and incest and they happen to have a pro-choice, pro-abortion worldview. Because when you say that, that means you are comfortable with the child getting the death penalty for something that their fathers did. And then you need to extrapolate that out to, children that are now living in the world outside the womb. If my dad did something horrible, do I get his punishment if I had nothing to do with it? You have to make them answer. Another question I would ask, and this may be the last one I'll give you on this particular subject, is since rape and incest account for less than 1%, it's actually well less than 1% of all abortions, it's like 0.3% of all abortions, are the other 99% of abortions morally wrong? Because again, they're bringing up the Hail Mary argument. And some people say, hey, you shouldn't bring this up because, puts you in the position where you might be having to defend the rapist. That's by no means what I would say or do in this particular scenario. But you're bringing up rape and incest, which accounts for a small fraction of all abortions. So are the other 99% morally wrong? These people would say, well, no, that doesn't mean they're morally wrong. Then it's like, why are we talking about the exception of the exception? That doesn't help. That doesn't make any sense. And this is another thing that I've done. This is something I've done for a group of people even here recently. You should even keep something like this on your phone if you feel like you're going to get into one of these things, because I have a side-by-side picture of two different ultrasounds. Okay. One of them is the ultrasound for my wife and I's upcoming baby, right? So it's going to be our second son, and it's an ultrasound of him. And then the other one is an ultrasound of a baby that was conceived in rape. A baby that is alive today, but a baby that was conceived in rape. And I show them the side-by-side picture and I say, which one is my son and which one is the one that was conceived in rape? Just point it out for me. This should be easy, right? Because, rape and incest, it's so horrible. We got to get rid of those babies. Just looking at these pictures alone, can you identify which one was conceived in rape, please? That drives the point home pretty quickly and pretty easily for these people, right? If they're going to be intellectually honest, they have to really reckon with that. That's a visual way for them to reckon with their worldview, which is absolutely reprehensible and evil. Okay. The next one that I would throw out there to you is, this is an argument that is actually thrown out at us, is what if the baby would be born into a family in poverty? What would happen then? And the reality is the financial status of a person doesn't define the worth of a person. It could define their net worth, but not their actual worth. So this one's kind of an easy one to deal with. Oh, the baby's going to be born in poverty. What could happen? Just ask them, is it better to be dead than poor? Because that's what they're saying. Again, extrapolate that out to people that are alive today that are poor. Should we kill those people? Because, gosh, poverty sucks, which it does. But do we kill the baby because they might end up in poverty? That doesn't make sense. And then the next one is like it. They'll say something like, what if the baby would be born with some sort of deformity or a handicap or a disease of some kind? And the reality is the health status of a person doesn't define the worth of a person, right? So just throw back in their face. Is it better to be dead than to have blank? Just fill in the blank with whatever deformity, handicap, and disease. Is it better to be dead than to have any of these things? Some of them might actually say yes because they have no worth for human life, but you got to have them give you an answer. So here's another argument that a lot of people will throw out because they think it's a good one is pro-lifers only care about the baby before it's born. They only care about the mom before it's born. The reality is they have no metrics whatsoever that can prove this. None whatsoever. Okay? And throw out some stats to them. There are around 800 abortion clinics here in the United States, give or take. There are around 3,000 pregnancy and motherhood resource centers in the United States that help women out before they give birth and after. 800 abortion clinics, 3,000 pregnancy and motherhood resource centers. And almost 100% of those centers are owned and operated by pro-life Christians. So this is how I would respond to these people is, how do you know that? You say pro-lifers only care about the baby and the mother before it's born. How do you know that? Can you prove that? Do you have any data to support that? Because they don't. And then also ask them this, if that were true, then why are there more pregnancy and motherhood resource centers than there are abortion clinics? Wouldn't it make sense that there would be an inequity there in the opposite way? Right, they have no good answer for that. Another argument they'll throw out is, even if the unwanted baby is taken to term and born, there wouldn't be a family available to adopt it. So we're talking about a woman that does not want to keep her child for whatever reason, but they're saying there wouldn't even be a family available to adopt it. The reality of this is there aren't too few families willing to adopt, okay? There are too few babies to be adopted. That's the reality. There are too few babies to be adopted. And the reason is abortion. That's the reason. Because pregnant women, when given the option between abortion and adoption, they overwhelmingly pick abortion. It's actually very selfish. They either want the baby for themselves or they want the baby to not exist at all. And Planned Parenthood absolutely aids in this because, Planned Parenthood likes to tout their numbers of adoption referrals, right? And even if you buy their adoption referral numbers, which you shouldn't because they lie about everything, right? More on that here in a second. Planned Parenthood kills 116 children for every one adoption referral. 116 babies murdered via abortion for every one adoption referral. And most of those referrals, using air quotes for that as well, ends in an abortion anyway. I mean, that's the reality here. Abortion is the main reason why there's such a small number of children that are available for families. In the United States currently, and this is according to Business Library, there are around 40 couples waiting for every one baby that is placed for adoption. 40. Again, we just pretend like, these babies they just get lost in the system. That doesn't happen by accident. There are 40 couples waiting to adopt, okay? So this is how I would respond to those people, is how familiar are you with the adoption statistics in the United States? More than likely, they're not. And that also is an onus is on you that you need to make sure that you're up on those stats as well. But then the other thing I would ask you, because this is going to come up, or that you should ask them rather, is an imperfect foster and adoption system a reason to kill people? Oh, the foster and adoption system is so broken and it's so crazy. And I've had people that have tried to go through the adoption system thing, and it is crazy and it is broken. So we should kill people? That's your plan? That's your idea? We should just kill people? It's absurd. Another thing you'll get is, why are you so anti-Planned Parenthood? Why are you so anti-Planned Parenthood? Come on, they help out so many women, right? But the reality is that Planned Parenthood is abortion. That's who they are. They're not about women's health. They're about abortion, which is not healthcare. Healthcare tries to preserve life. Abortion typically, not typically, almost always ends a life, right? It's an unsuccessful abortion that allows a baby to survive. Now, Planned Parenthood, they own more than half of all the abortion facilities in the United States, okay? So Planned Parenthood, year in, year out, even though the numbers for abortions are coming down in the United States, which thank God for that, they kill about a third of all the babies that are killed by abortion every year, okay? So the thing about it is, it's kind of crazy to even think about. If Planned Parenthood was on the list of causes of death in the United States, it would land right behind cancer and accidents. That's how deadly, how good Planned Parenthood is at dealing death. Okay. So even though the rate of abortion, like I mentioned, in the United States has come down over the last 30 years or so, like we're at 850,000, we used to be, over a million, well over a million. Planned Parenthood's numbers for abortions performed goes up every year. Again, Planned Parenthood, they just love women. They just want to help out women. The rate of abortion across the country has gone down, but the rate of abortions for Planned Parenthood specifically as a business has gone up. And this is a business that receives around $600 million in U.S. taxpayer funding annually, right? Even under the Trump administration. That's nearly 40% of the total revenue for the company for the year, right? A business that traffics in killing people gets almost half of their revenue from taxpayer funding, right? The Planned Parenthood is also, a lot of people don't know this, they're in the process of developing a mail order abortion program. Because currently you can go in and get the abortion pill, RU486. You can get that abortion pill without ever having to see a physical doctor in person. You can go to a Planned Parenthood facility. They basically do like a little Zoom call with a doctor, and they give you your abortion pill that allow you to kill your baby, right? But now they're trying to do it even easier to where you can just mail an abortion pill to someone without them ever having to see a doctor, right? Here's the other thing about Planned Parenthood. I love, crushing Planned Parenthood everywhere I can. They always claim, this is their big claim, this is their bumper sticker claim, that abortion is only 3% of their business. It's only 3%. You say we're all about abortion and you're just making things up, right? Outrage about outrage. You conservatives, you Christians, you're just making up lies. But the 3% number, that's what's false. That's what's the lie. Okay, so I'm going to read a quote here that's from the former Planned Parenthood Employee of the Year and the center point of the book and the movie Unplanned, and that's Abby Johnson. She said this: Planned Parenthood strategically skewed the 3% figure by unbundling non-abortion services so that each patient shows anywhere from 5 to 20 visits per appointment. In other words, if a woman receives 12 packs of birth control at her appointment, Planned Parenthood counts that appointment as 12 separate client visits. Planned Parenthood then does precisely the opposite for abortion-related appointments. If an abortion requires multiple appointments, Planned Parenthood bundles the appointments together to count only one visit. So while a trip to Planned Parenthood for contraception might count for a dozen different services, separate appointments for a pre-abortion consultation, an abortion procedure, and a follow-up appointment, if there is one, only count as one service. Okay? So they're gaming the numbers so they can kill more kids. So they kill around 350,000 kids, but they provide fewer than 10,000 prenatal services, because you talk about all these prenatal services. They don't do that. They don't do prenatals for the most part. Okay, you might have heard that they provide mammograms. There's currently not a single Planned Parenthood facility in the United States that was certified as a mammogram facility. Zero. So you might also hear someone say, but they give free cancer screenings and, free sexually transmitted infection tests and free breast exams and all these things. Guys, here's the reality. Here are the numbers. They provide less than 2% of the nationwide women's cancer screenings, less than 2%. They provide less than 1.5% of nationwide HIV tests. They provide less than 1% of nationwide PAP tests. But they deliberately kill children. Okay? And here's the other thing. They're more than happy to give you a free service when they know that you'll eventually pay them $500 for them to kill your kid. So if you're a contractor, you're more than happy to give somebody a free estimate for your work because you're assuming you're going to make way more off of them on the back end. That's why people give away things for free. It's because they assume they can get you to pay them more money on the back end. So this is how I would respond to that argument. Did you know that all Planned Parenthood facilities have an abortion quota? Because they do. Oh, they're not about abortion. They're about all these other things. I don't think they have a pap smear quota. They certainly have a abortion quota because they make a lot of money off of it. Did you know that? You should ask them this as well. Do you believe that only 3% of Planned Parenthood's business is abortion? Because they probably do. And that's when you can explain to them how they bundle and unbundle things in order to make it look better on their balance sheet every year. I would ask those questions. And this is the last one that I'll get into here. I appreciate you guys sticking around for all these arguments because they are very, very important. It's you're pro-death penalty. That means you're not pro-life. This is another really common one that comes up pretty often. You're pro-death penalty. That means you're not pro-life. Okay? The reality is this is meant to distract you by equating two things that are not related. Okay? Because I'm going to go back to the pro-life argument, which is simple, and we should all memorize it. Abortion intentionally and directly destroys innocent human life. It is always wrong to intentionally and directly destroy innocent human life. Okay? When the state or the nation kills someone, They are typically far from innocent. This person is typically guilty of murder beyond a reasonable doubt, first degree, right? Because we don't execute people just for raping someone. We'll execute them for raping and then killing them, or killing them and then raping them, whatever you're into, I guess. But these people are typically very, very guilty. So there's a very easy question I would ask this person. I would say something so stupid, and it's this. Are you saying that an innocent unborn child is the same as a murderer? Because that's what they're implying there. Because I think, based on, our biblical definitions of when we can take a life, I think that we can take the life of somebody that has forfeited their life by killing another person. And you're saying that the baby in the womb is just like that person. Now they're gonna quibble with that, but that's the reality that they have to get into. So guys, again, we spent a lot of time on getting into those arguments, and this is an episode that you should be able to go back and refer to at other points, because this is an incredibly good thing for you to understand and put in your brains. Because if you get into a discussion about this with somebody, right, you probably can't come back and just listen to this podcast again real quick. These arguments need to be in you. They need to be in your brain. They need to be in your heart. You need to be able to just pull them out at an instant. But I do have a couple of calls to action here before we get into the resources. 3 different calls to action for you specifically in terms of how you can take care of this. The first thing is encourage your children to remain abstinent until marriage. Now, you probably didn't think I was going to go the abstinence route with something like this, but here's the other reality, and we get this from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. 85% of all abortions that occur are by unmarried women. 85%. That's almost all of them. They occur in unmarried women. And we live in a culture now where sex is really, really cheap, and we can get it anytime we want it for whatever reason. And a consequence, if you look at it that way, of sex is a child, is procreation. Now we've untangled those things now, where sex is just this thing that we can do to make ourselves feel good inside and outside the church, and it's not bundled up with procreation anymore, right? We've done that as a society, including inside the church. But if we encourage our children to remain abstinent until marriage, the percentage chance of them getting an abortion goes down to almost nothing. Because typically in a loving marriage, when a child is conceived, that child is brought to term. So encourage your children to remain abstinent until marriage. The other call to action is don't worry as much about making abortion illegal. Make it unthinkable. Because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I still will as we move into the future, in terms of making abortion much, much harder to get. To make it illegal, to get rid of Roe v. Wade, to send it back to the states. Hundreds of thousands of children will be saved just in our country alone every single year if we're able to make that happen, right? An incredible amount if we make it illegal. But if you make it unthinkable, that's more powerful than illegal. Because people do illegal things all the time because they don't think they're unthinkable. Why do they deal drugs? Why do you speed crazy on the highway? Why do you do all these different things? It's because you don't think that there's something that you shouldn't do. You think the law is stupid, or you just really don't care. You're an outlaw. You want to do things outside the law. But when you make it unthinkable, that's why the numbers come down. Because if you think about it, in the United States, we're at only 850,000 abortions now. I think the highest was, 1.3 or 1.4 million children were killed in a calendar year via abortion. Where have we lost so many hundreds of thousands? I think it's because in a lot of ways, it's becoming unthinkable for a lot of people. Because the technology we have now, where you can see your baby, 3D ultrasounds, you can hear their heartbeat. We know more about what's happening gestationally because the trimester breakdown that came from the Supreme Court was just made up whole cloth out of thin air. It doesn't become a different thing from trimester 1 to trimester 2, and then from trimester 2 to trimester 3. It's the same thing, just a different level of development. Just like my toddler is not the same as he's going to be whenever he's 90 years old. He's the same person. He's just at a different level of development. But I think people are seeing this as like, oh my gosh, I can see my baby. I can hear its heartbeat. I don't think I want to kill this thing. That's why most Planned Parenthood facilities don't really have an ultrasound. Or if they do, they have the volume turned off so you can't hear the heartbeat because that affects their bottom line. And the last call to action is to memorize the pro-life argument, right? Guys, I mean, you're an hour and 15 minutes in now, so you might as well keep going with me. But this is what you should memorize. This should be the number one thing that you take away from this podcast. Abortion intentionally and directly destroys innocent human life. It is always wrong to intentionally and directly destroy innocent human life. Okay? So that's the calls to action. Encourage your children to remain abstinent until marriage. Don't worry as much about making abortion illegal. Make it unthinkable. and memorize the pro-abortion argument. I'll give it to you one more time. Abortion intentionally and directly destroys innocent human life. It is always wrong to intentionally and directly destroy innocent human life. So some resources I've got for you that I think you guys should check out. And I'll make sure these are in the show notes as well. You should definitely, well, actually, we'll go ahead and do the quick resilience boost and I'll back into that. So obviously, as you guys know by now, we are a men's ministry and our mission is equipping men to push back darkness. And we do that by providing content like this podcast that helps you guys forge spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So here are a couple of websites I want to give you. So Live Action and Life News. So Live Action gives you a ton of very practical ways to push back, and they keep you up on the news. So they've got YouTube videos that will help you argue, help you learn more about the subject of abortion. And Life News is basically up to date daily in terms of what's happening with abortion around the world. And then there's a couple of books. There's a lot of books kind of on this space, but the two that I think are the best. The first is What to Say When, which I mentioned a lot in this episode, The Complete New Guide to Discussing Abortion. And that's by Sean Carney and Steve Carlin. Those guys will be on the podcast here soon, so be looking out for that. And then also the other one is by R.C. Sproul, the late R.C. Sproul, Abortion, A Rational Look at an Emotional Issue. That book is also on our 100 books that every modern Christian man should read list, which is on our website. And then in terms of our podcast, okay, here are some old episodes that I would tell you to go back to if you want to have more content that's like this. Episode 6 was called Abortion. Episode 78 was called Answering 17 Pro-Abortion Arguments. Episodes 145 and 194 were with Lila Rose. She is actually the founder and CEO and president of Live Action. So those were fantastic conversations with her. And then also I mentioned earlier, episode 221, Keeping Babies Alive Just Long Enough to Harvest Their Organs. All that is there. And guys, again, I'm going to put more stuff in the show notes. So some of the stuff that I said, some of the numbers that I threw out there, I want to make sure you know that those are accurate numbers. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening to this podcast. We do appreciate it. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and review. If you want to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok and like us on Facebook. And you can check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band August Burns Red for allowing us to use their music for our content. The intro-outro track is their song Cutting the Ties, which is off their 10th anniversary re-recording of the album Leveler. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.